environmentally friendly, healthy, tasty, and affordable. Palm oil-free, sausage for 2.20 rubles, antibiotic-free chicken, sprat in tomato sauce with 50 grams of whole-grain wheat vodka, and rye bread, kefir, in foil-sealed bottles, all strictly adhering to the Soviet GOST standard. This GOST standard still holds a certain magic for Soviet Union nostalgists, almost like a spell, clouding thoughts and creating a trance of Soviet cliches deeply ingrained by past propaganda and ideology. Friends, the Documentalist Project is here. Today, we'll delve into the story of these legendary Soviet products. At the start, I briefly touched on the stereotypes and myths that always surround this topic. Cheap prices and supposedly guaranteed quality. But in reality, as with so many aspects of the Soviet Union, where deception and concept swapping were the norm, things were not nearly as colorful, but on the contrary, horrible. Today, we're focusing on barley, soybeans, and acorns, specifically what coffee was like in the USSR, so-called coffee. Why did people drink it but feel no energy boost? It's simple. There was no caffeine, so there was no reason for the invigorating effect that real coffee brings. What ingredients were in the famous doctor's sausage? According to GOST, it was supposed to be high-quality meat, yet sometimes it tasted like cardboard. Is it really true that palm oil was not used in the huge food industry when it was necessary to feed millions of poor and impoverished people of the country because they claimed it did not exist? Not quite. This question is key to understanding the naturalness and nutrition of these products. Throughout this episode, we'll uncover these answers and reveal how the Soviet Union often packaged inferior, unhealthy ingredients, offal, trans fats, dyes, and other unpleasant additions under bright wrappers and appealing narratives, presenting them as nectar or even medicine.
Целебный, приятно освежающий напиток Байкал. Попробуйте. Он имеет неповторимый аромат, бодрит и придает новые силы.
Stay tuned, hit a like or dislike because YouTube can handle anything, and so can we. Also, leave comments. In this case, YouTube will estimate the content as interesting and recommend it to as many viewers as possible. Let's start with coffee. I personally love it, drinking 3 or 4 cups a day for nearly 20 years. Living in Lviv, a city with a thriving coffee culture, I can find beans from places like Tanzania, Mexico, Ethiopia, and Colombia, each with a distinct flavor. Imagining life without this variety makes it hard to envision living under Soviet rule. Why so? It's that simple. In the USSR, enjoying real coffee was virtually impossible. Back then, you either needed connections or the patience to wait in hours-long lines whenever natural, imported coffee sporadically appeared in stores. Some people might remember this rare product would come from India, and it looked mostly like this. I'm talking about the late 80s at least. I still remember the tin cans that coffee was sold in, which many people later reused for keeping the nails, screws, and other small items. The cost of coffee back then was incredibly high. One can could cost as much as a bottle of good cognac. Because of this, if someone managed to buy a tin, it was often saved for special occasions, like New Year's or birthdays, when friends would gather and it could be served as a rare treat. So, what did the people of the Soviet Union drink on a daily basis besides water and vodka? They drank so-called coffee drinks, which contained anything but coffee: chicory, soy, barley, oats, and even acorns. Sometimes, even ground chestnuts were added. Our audience is mostly people around my age or even younger. They definitely don't remember living in a socialist paradise. So that they wouldn't think I was cheating and telling lies, we found the pictures of what the packages of so-called coffee drinks looked like. Here's a drink of natural coffee, 10%, barley 40%, chicory 25%, rye 15%, oats 10%. Apparently this coffee would be very good for horses. Here's Arctic coffee drink. It contains more natural coffee, 15%. But there is plenty of barley, soybeans, and acorns. To be honest, Now it all looks cringy. Since the channel is historical, not culinary, I'll try to explain why. Interestingly, these coffee substitutes weren't an invention of the Soviet food industry. In Europe, people drank similar drinks during World War I due to the disruptions in production, and all logistics routes were stopped. Many surrogates appeared indeed. However, after the war, Europeans quickly returned to regular coffee made from real coffee beans. In the Soviet Union, though, these substitutes with a specific smell and taste lingered. What flavor can acorns give? Such coffee drinks appeared after the Second World War and were especially popular in the 1960s and 70s when shortages became extreme. In a moment, we will move on to other Soviet classics that were considered healthy. I just want to mention a few figures and show that even in Tsarist Russia, people arguably lived better than under the so-called caring communist regime. For instance, in 1913, before World War I, the Russian Empire imported 12,000 tons of coffee beans. But in 1921, when Lenin and the Bolsheviks took over and brought the communist monster to life, only 5 tons were imported. Throughout the 1930s and into the early 90s, coffee became a rare luxury. During World War II, while German and Allied troops received real chocolate and coffee, in the USSR, coffee was reserved for pilots and wounded soldiers, with only 30 grams allocated per month. On the home front, it was drunk exclusively by the elite, including people's artists, academics, and Stalin Prize winners. The general population could only dream of coffee. It was in short supply by the early 1990s. When available, it cost a fortune, so they had to drink common alternatives.
Я в весеннем лесу пил березовый сок с ненаглядной пивуньей в стогу ночевал.
Now we'll tell you about the rest of the foods. So stay tuned and don't forget to comment on the video. In particular, write if you remember the Indian coffee I mentioned. It seems to be the most common in those days. Now, let's talk about the legendary Soviet boiled sausage, often touted as being nearly 100% top-quality meat, guaranteed by the state standard, or GOST. This is the state quality standard. But here's the secret. GOST didn't truly guarantee quality in the USSR. It simply listed the ingredients and their possible proportions that could be used. This didn't mean they were used. And every year, the standard was subject to change, especially during periods of scarcity. For example, in 1972, during a severe drought, there was a massive meat shortage, and the GOST was quickly revised to allow more third-party additives. These additives included emulsifiers, starch, food plasma, bone broth, flavor enhancers, and many other things. The idea that GOST was some kind of gold standard was a big misconception, one that people continue to believe to this day. We're going to tell you what this legendary Soviet sausage for 220 rubles looked like and what people ate back then. For that, I went through the archives and downloaded an interesting document. This is the GOST number 2367-79 of 1979. It regulates the production of cooked sausages, bratwursts, and meatloaves. And if we browse through the pages, we will find a lot of interesting things. Take a look for yourself. The technical requirements state that the following raw materials are used to make boiled sausages. And there we see offal, starch, milk powder, and a long list of sodium in various forms, such as sodium nitrous acid or sodium nitrite, color improver, and preservative. Simply put, the food additive E250. And besides this, sodium tripolyphosphate, a food stabilizer, known as the additive E451, sodium phosphoric acid, sodium pyrophosphoric acid, sodium carbon dioxide, and many more. We will display this piece of the document on the screen so that you can see it for yourself. There were plenty of dyes and stabilizers, yet people who still reminisce about this natural sausage may not realize what it truly contained. The reality was that almost everything but meat went into this sausage. Here it says that instead of beef, pork, lamb, it is allowed to use a protein stabilizer, beef and pork meat mass, food plasma, starch, or wheat flour. In other words, instead of meat, it could be a mixture of boiled bones, starch, bone meal, and food plasma, which was liberally used by manufacturers. As for the protein stabilizer, it is nothing more than ground skin and tendons. Imported meats like buffalo or yak could also be included. All perfectly acceptable under GOST. Check it for yourself. By the way, the imported meat often arrived at factories in frozen blocks, sometimes still wrapped in cardboard and cellophane that had to be removed before processing. Due to a lack of time and resources, these blocks were frequently ground up without fully removing the packaging, leading to the infamous joke about toilet paper and Soviet sausage. While it wasn't actual toilet paper, since even that was in short supply, bits of cardboard did make it into the mix. When you think about all the Soviet atrocities, unsanitary conditions, and negligence, you realize that it was better not to eat such sausage back then. This period is well illustrated by Soviet-era photos showing people scavenging for scraps on the ground. When you see images like these, it's clear that the revered GOST standard wasn't the unchanging quality mark it's often remembered as. By the way, so that the Russian peace fans don't contend that this is some kind of post-war period when the country was starving, devastated by the war against the Nazis, I can reassure you this photo was taken in the 80s, and I myself could have stood like that frightened kid in the hat. By the way, jokes aside, I remember well that back in the 80s my father used to bring us ice cream in a glass jar from the district center. During the ride on a hot bus, it was not so cold and tasty anymore. Now it gets me thinking, if it had been sold in a village store, he wouldn't have bothered to bring it from the city. Since we're talking about ice cream, I'll add in larger Soviet cities, creamy ice cream was accessible, but for those in rural areas, it was a different story. Villagers and townsfolk usually had to settle for cheaper, lower-quality dairy products that were made with vegetable fats. This brings us to the topic of palm oil. Another ingredient the USSR nostalgists claim was never used back then, unlike nowadays. But this is another huge lie. Ignorance, or deliberate manipulation. Palm oil started being imported in the 1960s and was listed in many GOST standards. There is no official explanation for the need to import this product to the USSR. Obviously, this was due to the growing food shortage. In 1960, as the country faced severe shortages, ingredients like butter, milk, and even semi-finished meat products vanished from store shelves. The food industry workers then turned to palm oil, which they had been introduced to in friendly Cameroon, to address these shortages. In 1963 alone, over 2,000 tons of palm oil were imported from Indonesia, with numbers continuing to rise in the following years. If you look at the figures, in 1982, the Communist Empire imported 376,000 tons of this product, and in 1989, it was over 430,000. So, where did this palm oil go? Primarily into the production of margarine, which was then used in confectionery, chocolate, sweets, milk, dairy products, and even butter. It also found its way into baked goods, semi-finished products, and processed cheese, often hidden on labels under the vague term solid fats.
Из плавленных сыров действительно можно приготовить и салаты, и первые, и вторые блюда, и даже десерт. И для этого вовсе не обязательно быть чародеем.
The worst part? Along with the listed products, palm oil was even used in the Soviet infant formula as a substitute for breast milk. These mixtures contained cow milk, sugar, and grain extracts, meaning Soviet infants were exposed to the realities of life in a struggling economy right from birth. Friends, we are about to wrap up now. Be sure to watch the video to the end, where we'll tell you about another equally important thing: the Soviet obsession with pesticides, a poison that killed weeds and insects. To increase crop yields and meet the government's 5-year plans, fields across the USSR were heavily treated with chemicals. The consequences for human health were largely ignored, as were environmental impacts. To promote these chemicals, Soyuz Kimzashchita spared neither effort nor expense for elaborate advertisements. In the 1980s, it was something unprecedented.
Мы жуки, мы жужуки, мы пришли как чужаки. Наведем порядок здесь. Мы грозные, косматые, как тигры полосатые, прожорливые очень, все изгрызем и сточим.
Мы червячки, мы очень любим яблочки. Мы все на яблочках сидим и все едим.
И зачем?
Полихом. Вот что для нас чистая погибель.
Остается надеяться, что садоводы и огородники так и не воспользуются этим коварным изобретением.
Иначе наша песенка
Subsequently, this low-grade poison was everywhere, which once again dispelled the myth of the naturalness and harmlessness of the Soviet products. By the 1970s, around 20% of fertile land was contaminated with pesticides. The infamous insecticide DDT, for example, was found in 8% of meat samples and in over half of potato, carrot, and beet samples. Even worse, in 1988, 30% of baby milk powder samples contained DDT at levels 5 times higher than the acceptable standard. In response to this contamination, the head official of the Food Hygiene Department of the USSR Ministry of Health, Ms. Selivanova, stated that there was simply no alternative to chemical protection, acknowledging the harm but dismissing it as a necessary sacrifice. In essence, losses were accepted, and no one bothered to calculate the full human toll. So cynical and direct. So what can we say about Soviet products and their supposed quality and naturalness? Ultimately, there was no true quality. The country was poor, struggling, and showed little regard for the well-being of its people. Many suffered from various illnesses and lived in harsh conditions. The nostalgia for a lost paradise is likely just a psychological effect, known as duckling syndrome. This term is used in psychology when people idealize their first experiences. So when a person encounters a phenomenon or object for the first time in their life, they retain the belief that those times were inherently better and that all subsequent times are only getting worse. No persuasion can affect such people. All you'll hear in response is, "Don't talk nonsense. It used to be better." In the end, we'll share some photos from the USSR showing this reality. For some, these images may bring back childhood memories. For others, especially those born after the Soviet collapse, they may seem like a glimpse into another world. These are the people we can truly envy. Take care, and see you next time.